the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do want to mention we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We have opened up our Discord channel server to new patrons, and you should receive an invitation should you decide to become a patron. And then Taylor has decided to offer some reading groups there. So just want to give something back to our listeners. Today, Taylor and I, though, will be very proud to present to you all Professor David Carr, currently Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Emory University, specializing in history and philosophy. He is translator of Husserl's Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, and the author of 6 books, including Interpreting Husserl, Time, Narrative, and History, and most recently, and the book that we'll primarily be focusing on today, Historical Experience, Essays on the Phenomenology of History. And so, David, just a hearty welcome to you. Thanks so much for joining Taylor and I.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. This is my first experience of this sort of thing, so it's all new to me.
This is your first podcast invitation, or have you declined before? Have you ever been invited on a podcast?
No, I've never even been invited, so this is really a first.
You know, one of the things that I really like about this format, and I'm not talking about our podcast in particular, but if you will, the rise of podcasts, for better or worse, is, and your book starts off mentioning, obviously, you may have been collecting these essays and finalizing it during the pandemic, where, as we know, the traditional method of meeting, at least in America in the past, however, at least during my generation, and I assume during yours, for example, at SPEP, was kind of curtailed, and some of it moved online. And so I like to think of the podcast as a sort of microcosm of the conference. And I think I kind of mentioned that the mentality is it's after the conference, you know, you have the Q&A at the end of a paper or of a panel, and some people ask decent questions, other people are grandstanding or wanting to ask their own questions, but it's after the conference that you sort of either gather with new acquaintances that you just met or some old colleagues, and you meet at a bar or at a dinner, and you sort of continue conversations that were maybe just beginning to skim the surface, and you get to talk in a sort of intimate but perhaps informal yet rigorous manner. And so I think the podcast definitely felt for me in a time when we were all cloistering a little bit, to be able to reach beyond those walls in a safe and still engaging manner.
Well, I'm very familiar with that. So, yeah, that's great. That's the first time I've heard that explanation for the rise of podcasts, and I certainly accept it. It makes sense to me.
I think maybe that might be the most charitable way I could put it. Obviously, there are podcasts that are directed towards each and every type of hobby we can imagine too. And so that's part of it. I mean, in my day in undergraduate, in the early aughts and mid-aughts, it was blogs. That's where everyone had their little blog, and then you might link together blogs and people would be commenting on. That was kind of the, not that it's gone away, but it has, maybe it plateaued and receded a little bit, if you will.
Tell me the difference between a blog and a podcast.
I would say primarily the podcast is audio, so it can be experienced. A lot of people put on our podcast. Some of our listeners tell us they put on our podcast when they do menial tasks like washing the dishes or vacuuming, and some even are able to listen while they're at work because they maybe have that kind of bureaucratic type job or
Okay.
something like this. Whereas a blog, I think, would be much more focused towards written content. So it's a way of maybe they're both, I think, potentially para academic forms where we don't necessarily have to be affiliated with institutes, but can still disseminate ideas in ways in which one is primarily written. So you don't need to necessarily either go through the academic institution or even a publishing house. You can
Mhm.
self-publish in a very inexpensive and freely acquired way. And then the podcast, I think, is much more audio, sometimes visual, but it can be something done on the go, right? Multitasking, if you will. So I kind of think the blog is less able to accommodate that kind of multitasking, where it is just sometimes you can follow your favorite writers and follow them in kind of real time as they're perhaps either curating research notes or putting forward the idea for their next book or
Okay, well, great. I've got some dishes I need to wash. Maybe I can get started on those. Well,
I now I'm glad you asked, and I'm also glad you asked after the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Most people just take that as a given that perhaps it exists either somewhere communally or in the mind, or it's kind of an esoteric. You have been initiated to the People's Institute now, and but I do want to hear more about you, David. I mentioned that one of the questions we always ask is after the philosophical origin story, as we like to call it, as though our guests were kind of superheroes, and we get to hear from your, if you will, considering in light of your book, the phenomenology of your historical experience of when you maybe first became aware that you wanted to go into something like philosophy, and when you maybe caught that spark of
oh,
being interested in doing this, and if you will maybe tie in along the way getting into Husserl. And I mean, you translated the crisis of European sciences in your late 20s, right? So I'm interested about this trajectory, and if you can give us either an anecdote or some sort of recollection that can kind of help put in perspective your journey.
okay. Well, I'd be glad to do that. It's always fun to talk about myself, I guess. And, philosophy itself really caught hold of me when I was in college. I had read some stuff in high school, and I think it was mostly William James and a few other things that caught my attention. But a lot of it had to do, I must say, with my religious upbringing. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and my mother was a minister's wife, and so this was the atmosphere in which I was raised. It was a very liberal one, theologically and politically. So it wasn't constricting in that sense, but I started having questions and started reading stuff that didn't really fall within that domain. So I should say that a lot of people I know in philosophy come from this kind of background, disaffected
Mm-hmm.
with religion, and I also believe that this is the way philosophy began in Greece
Mm-hmm.
by people who started questioning the mythological accounts of reality and so on, and that was true of Plato and Aristotle and most of the pre-Socratics. So it's a common story, I think, and it's certainly mine. And I was very interested in politics and international relations and thought I'd major in something like that. But when I got to college, I wanted to do some philosophy and not miss out on that. Well, I did, and I really got hooked. And so politics and international relations have to take care of themselves, unfortunately. And I shifted my attention to philosophy very early on. So then went right on to graduate school, and the rest is history. you might say. So
Before getting into how you found yourself translating the crisis, how and that story, because I am interested. I do have to say, and this is just glancing at your Wikipedia page, you have a kind of heralded, or what do you want to call it? There's a star-studded. What's the way of putting it? Your mentors, your teachers, you had just mentioned a few of them: Wilfrid Sellers, Bernstein. What you studied with Lowith, who you mentioned throughout this book. You studied with. I know in France you studied with Ricoeur, who you talk about as well in the introduction and in some of your other books like Time Narrative and History. You can name. Oh, you studied with Gadamer, right?
Yep.
So these are some of the big names in philosophy, and I guess I assume you sought them out because of the particular path you were pursuing in your philosophical studies, or was this more
well,
of
yeah,
a
I was really kind of at the right place at the right time
Mhm.
for a lot of these people. I started graduate school at Yale, where I had done my undergraduate work, and was already working with Sellers and Bernstein and others there. Paul Ricoeur visited Yale in my first year of graduate school, and I met him and talked to him. He was very open and welcoming, and I applied for a Fulbright, and he helped me with my application. He wrote a letter
That's
for me.
amazing.
And so off I went in my second year to spend a year in Paris working with him. I had been in Germany before that as a junior, and that's where I studied. I can't really say I studied with him. I was, 19 years old, and Löwit and Gadamer were the primary professors at Heidelberg at that time, and I just sat in their classes, listened to
Right.
them. I didn't really even meet them. I met Gadamer later on, but
Okay.
they were there, and this is really a great education. So that got me started on the path to what I did later, which was taking up phenomenology. My first interest was coming out of Heidelberg, was in Heidegger. I had
Right.
read Heidegger and written about him, a senior essay and that kind of thing, and was very taken by Heidegger. But then I kind of discovered Husserl after that, going backwards, so to speak. And what I discovered was that there was some parts of Heidegger that I liked and others that I didn't.
hmm
Ones that I liked had already been said by Husserl.
Okay.
That kind of got me interested in Husserl. And then I worked on my dissertation, and then I was, things were sort of happening at that time. Northwestern was beginning to publish these translations of
Right.
Husserl, of which there were not many at that time. So I kind of volunteered because by this time my German was pretty good, and I asked them if they would like me to do one of their translations, and they said yes, and that's when I took that on. After I finished my dissertation, I insisted on finishing that first, but then I took up the crisis and spent a lot of time, several years, finishing that translation.
I mean, just in the translator's introduction, you mentioned all of the documents you consulted alongside of it. I think of there's like 9 appendices to the crisis that
Yeah.
and the different versions and the states in which the crisis itself was perhaps a little in crisis. It was uncompleted by the time of Husserl's death. Eugen Fink had his hand in trying to get part 3, which was the longest part we have extant, I suppose,
Right.
sort of in publishing state. So this was not, I mean, first of all, the first difficulty is the book not being completed, but second of all, Husserl also trying to make these last minute changes. And so this is a text itself that was in disarray. That had to be a daunting task for any translator.
Yeah, that was the first thing. I mean, the thing also that many people didn't realize, you see, because these beautiful Husserliana volumes were coming out, And this was one of them. Some of them had already been published, like Ideas One and Cartesian Relations, but the Crisis appeared in this beautiful volume, and it looked like a finished book, but it wasn't. It was a incomplete book with a lot of extra stuff thrown in. And so that's what I had to negotiate. In fact, I found even just repetitions, incomplete sentences, all kinds of stuff that made translating very difficult. And that's why it took me so long, I think. But also because I couldn't do more than a couple hours a day. I got sick of it. Just put it aside and wait till the next day to continue. So it took me a number of years to finish it. I wouldn't exactly call it a labor of love. For one thing, I resolved never to translate again.
I was wondering if that may have put the nail in the coffin for your translating career.
Believe me, I was asked by, on several occasions to translate other works by Husserl, and I said, no, thank you.
Now, was it just Husserl himself, or just in general, you were like, no other, doesn't matter who writes?
Well, I don't know, because I have not really ever tried to translate anybody else.
Okay.
But in this case, there's something called the paradox of translation. Now, this is my coining. I mean, I just made this up, but the paradox goes like this. In order to translate well, you have to know the language so well that in reading it, you don't translate it, you just read it. And so every attempt to put it in another language means you have to go, well, what I did is I had these huge dictionaries, and I was always reading the dictionaries, not because I didn't know what the text meant, but because I didn't have the English equivalents at my disposal. And so I had to look in the German English dictionary to see, what are all the suggestions that I could of English terms that I could use. So if you don't know the language well enough, then you shouldn't be translating. If you do know it well enough, then translating is a chore. It's an extra thing over and above reading of the text. And that was one of the things that annoyed me about the process. And also, I felt that, you might say, well, this is a way to get to know a text really well. But I found that there were other texts that I knew much better than this that I hadn't translated. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, for example. And so it, just from a personal point of view, it didn't seem like it was bringing me that much. Now, maybe I should, be more selfless and consider my service to the community and all that. But I think I did my service, and
you did your time.
I did my time, and was not interested in doing any more. But I've spent a lot of time writing about the Crisis over the years, and so you might say I still haven't figured it out. It's a very enigmatic text, and has a lot of puzzles and problems that are still with me. But I don't know if that has to do with translating it. By the way, is it you that did some translation?
I'm still working on some translations right now, but I translated one of Guattari's books. It's called The Machinic Unconscious, which is unrelated to the title of the podcast. It's kind of a happy coincidence that Coop named this podcast The Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. I assume after
it's a great title.
Guattari's book. I translated Guattari's book, The Machinic Unconscious. I translated some of Francois Laruelle, who himself has written on Husserl. In fact, one of his main books, Principles of Non-Philosophy, is very much inspired by Husserlian investigations. I've translated some of Gilbert Simondon, who was an influence on Deleuze. I mentioned Deleuze before the podcast, and he's one of my favorites. And I know we're not going to talk about Deleuze, but I've always found it fascinating when Deleuze deploys Husserl's thinking, because Husserl is neither, I would say, a friend like Spinoza or Bergson, or an enemy like Kant and Hegel. He is kind of Switzerland, kind of like neutral territory to a certain extent. One thing before, I guess, moving to this book and some of the themes we see throughout your work, I do have an idea of connecting the crisis to, we can see the seeds of a lot of your investigations throughout your work, starting with the crisis. But I would say I like your notion of a paradox of translation, because you're right. You almost describe it phenomenologically. When you're translating, you are not necessarily looking at, for me, French, for you, German, and then the English is going through your head. You have to do a kind of a step back. You have to kind of take a meta level, which is not how you experience the text phenomenologically, right? You have to kind of do a step back and then sort of think about it in one's own language. I do think that the difficulties for each particular language are singular. For French and German, I assume syntax and grammar, you do not want to copy the order of words in English. I think, not to pun, but to compound some of the difficulties in German, as you point out in your translator's introduction, so many compound nouns in German, which are so either effortless, even if they're neologisms, but they're so common to the way of phrasing. You don't have a singular term to necessarily stand in. And if you do, you are usually crafting neologisms that are just needlessly complicated. And so
exactly, yeah. And I think the better solution is often just a kind of rewriting,
yeah,
sometimes using maybe more words than, the idea that every word can be translated one to one by another word consistently, that just doesn't work, because
that's a fallacy. Yeah.
In English, as in German, any other language, words take on different meanings depending on the context. And so you can't always translate them the same way. This is a quarrel that I have with a lot of other translators who have badly translated Husserl, and there are many.
And there's bad Heidegger translations too, just to think about another.
Oh boy. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
That's a whole other story.
Yes.
Heidegger and Husserl is not the same kind of writer that Heidegger is. Husserl is straightforward, stodgy, pretty much standard Professorendeutsch of the of the period. And Heidegger's trying to make up all this new stuff.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
One way I put it is that Heidegger is making up new vocabulary or old ideas. And Husserl's problem is that he's got new ideas, but he's using an old vocabulary. So
yeah.
The result is not good in either case, I think. And so that's part of the problem with Husserl, is that his ideas are much more explosive than his language.
This also points to the problem of machine translation, because machine translation, even if it tends to privilege certain rote means of rendering, that can't do justice to some of the flexibility at hand.
Yeah, well, I don't know much about machine translation. That's I have a daughter who's a professional translator who actually she translates from French to English mostly, and sort of business and other stuff. And I keep asking her if she is worried about, AI and all this stuff. And she says, no. Her specialty is actually legal translation.
Right. Okay.
She is not worried at all, because there's just no way that the subtleties and complexities of legal language can be correctly translated by machines or by computers or whatever. I hope she's right for the sake of her livelihood. But anyway, I haven't had any experience with it myself, so I just don't know.
I think if you were sort of really desperate to know the sense of the broad sense of certain types of maybe everyday use, sure, it could do a stand-in. But if we're talking about within each discipline, whether it be philosophy or law or etc., they're going to have their own standards and needs for the kind of nuance and the needs for a human hand involved. And so I would say that her job is pretty secure. And it is ironic that you did not pass on your your distaste for translation to your daughter, that she didn't have the same in any case. I guess the last thing I'll say, I will add a corollary to your paradox that you've made up, if you don't mind,
Sure.
because I do think one of the reasons perhaps you continue some of the investigations of the crisis, whether it's citing it directly or bringing in some of the problems that are raised, if not obviously solved by Husserl in that work, is because, as you mentioned, translating, whether it be as I kind of use the term, that phenomenological experience of reading the text and you're reading it in a certain language, but you have to take the step back. That's one aspect of the paradigm. But the other, my corollary is to understand the text you've translated. You don't necessarily do that simultaneously as you're translating. I think they're different types of, I don't want to say neurologically, different types of brain space or different types of neural paths, but there's a totally different experience in translating. And I include revising. When I read translations in the English that I've produced and then try to revise it and clear it up and check it against the original and make sure it's ready for publication, that still too is in a translating mode. It's when it's finally like translated and there's been enough time to take a step back and breathe and then read it again.
Yeah.
And read it for pleasure, but also read it for understanding. It's a different experience completely.
Right. And of course, one of the, I mean, I can complain endlessly about other people's translations. One of the problems they have is that they are often not English, not good English. That's because what they think they're doing is providing a method for reconstructing the German text. Right. So you have this one-to-one correspondence, and you see this word and you say, oh, that must mean such and such. But that's not what translation is about. It's got to be readable and understandable. And it's got to be in English. That's got to be English language and not some hybrid that, is incomprehensible.
I guess the last thing I'll say about translation, and hopefully the audience has given us the the patience, because this is part of what I like. I love when I get to talk a little bit of shop with other translators, former translators. As you're on appeal at this point. I guess I would say the last thing I would say about this is that there is a sense when I first started translating, and you asked about what blogs are for. When I first started writing on blogs, I was also first translating, feeling out my understanding of French, which at the time was very rudimentary. I had Spanish, I had Latin background. French I had one semester of it. And so I was really kind of learning by doing. And I would say my main problem, I think, was trying to be too faithful to the text, which not just means too literal, but trying to do, and part of it is that one-to-one correspondence, but trying to make like a mirror, use English and say French that can mirror each other. And I think that paradoxically, I think is why when there's I forget the Italian, but it's to translate is to betray. It almost sounds the same. I'm blanking, but to translate is betray.
Yeah, I recognize it too, but I don't know who said it.
I would say, I think this can and should be read in a positive rather than pejorative light, because if you there's a way of remaining faithful to the original that actually distorts it rather than betrays it in a positive way, if that makes any sense.
Traduttore, traditore, something like that, isn't it?
Yeah. That's so.
I'm sure I'm not getting it right, but I've heard it. I don't know who said it.
I do think that that by betraying, you remain more faithful than if you were to try to set out to remain faithful in this kind of blind and hesitating, or this way of, as though one could merely mirror. One of the things I would say, and this opens up to your current book that we're going to discuss, was historical experience essays in the Phenomenology of History, is precisely, and I guess I'm sort of giving you a springboard to whether or not to confirm it or to maybe give some context, is you even point out in your translator's introduction the fact that, I guess, a couple things. One is that Husserl mentions that he is undertaking a kind of teleological historical introduction of phenomenology. And I think that we obviously see, even in the sections of your book, questions about teleology and obviously questions about history. It's in the title, but I guess you point out that something has shifted. It's as though now Husserl is, what is the, I guess for you pointed out, like, the historical is now front and center when it was either bracketed or seemingly not as essential to phenomenological method.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I feel like just those two little nuggets from what perhaps shows a shift at the end of Husserl's life in the Crisis book kind of helps to give some scaffolding to the trajectory that you that you've been tracing for the past 40 plus years.
Yeah. Well, certainly that's, I've always maintained that what's really new about the Crisis is the historical part. That is, and it's not just, I mean, Husserl earlier on, especially in Philosophy as Rigorous Science in that period, pretty clearly distinguished between doing philosophy and doing the history of philosophy. I mean, he said history of philosophy is just fine, but it's not the same as philosophy. To do philosophy, we have to ask, what the issues are and bracket. He actually bracketed in the ideas. He had something called the philosophical epoche, and what it amounted to was forget about the other philosophers.
Yeah.
Don't talk about them. Just focus on your own thing. And that's what he thought phenomenology had to do. But then now here he is, in his 70s, and for a whole lot of reasons, which we can talk about, yes. Suddenly he realizes that no, we have to understand where we've come from. And that includes philosophy and phenomenology. And so we have to trace its origins, and we have to tell the story of how it got where it is. So that's where the historical part comes in, and it's now an essential part of what he's doing. It's not an inessential or just a side act or something like that. It's absolutely central, and that's where he talks about this teleological historical introduction to phenomenology.
I suppose what's interesting is that, and you would know the German, and I'll even let you give Husserl's German. I'm trying to think of back to the things themselves, and I know things in Husserl's German is not ding, right? It not brute stuff, but something a little bit more abstract, perhaps, right? Sachen.
Sachen is the matters, you might say, the issues, and that's a term that he uses very early on. And what it really means is what I said before: don't talk about the philosophers, talk about the issues.
But now it seems that perhaps if we bring in the historical light, perhaps they aren't so easily separable, that we do, as you said, and you point, and this too goes to your translator's introduction. I remember that there is this philosophical epoche that brackets out other philosophers because they're just kind of it's just going to muddy the waters or render discussions perhaps in the history of philosophy too historical and not philosophical enough or something like this. But it does feel like, and again, I'm just trying to think about the distinction in German between Ding and Sach, that maybe there's something a little bit that allows for a little bit more leeway for the historical, and including a little bit of the history of philosophy to filter in that. Even if we are going back to the things themselves, sometimes the things themselves may include the history of philosophy. Or am I?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not so much the things, but the questions. You see.
Okay.
and this, by the way, is an interesting parallel to analytic philosophy, which of course been dominant in the English-speaking world. And there you have the dominance of the idea that there's philosophy and there's history of philosophy, and the two are totally separate. And
Right.
now Husserl, was actually came of age in a time in German philosophy when people talked about all they did was the history of philosophy. They're doing Neo-Kantianism was all about Kant, and then there were studies of Plato and this and that and the other thing. And that's all philosophy professors did, was to talk about the tradition. And Husserl was one of those who came along and said, no, we've got to stop that and start really doing philosophy. That's where this expression zu den Sachen selbst comes from. And what I'm saying, of course, is that by the time he got later in life, he realized that this was a mistake, that you can't do philosophy without being aware of its history, because it doesn't come out of nowhere.
Yes.
Analytic philosophers tend to think that the problem, the problem of this, the problem of that, they're just sitting there in the air, and all we have to do is pull them down and solve them. Whereas, in fact, those problems come from the tradition. They come from the history of thought, and these guys are not the first people to think of them. So this is a long process of discovery that Husserl made, I think, and shows up in his last work.
And I mentioned before the show, and I'm just going to rephrase it: the notes that I have in the document that we're looking at, the Google
Yeah, I was
Doc
wondering
that I
about
made.
those are your notes?
Those they're the notes. I'm thinking of them as refrains. Some of the refrains I pulled out of reading your work. And I guess that some of them are just my mental notes, but some of them are the refrains I tried to pull out from your work, and one of them being the when you cite Dilthey and
Dilthey.
Dilthey. Thank you for I see these are whenever you don't get to say a word in company that can tell you the pronunciation. When you cite Dilthey, you point out, or one of the citations that recurs as a refrain throughout your work is, before being students of history or before studying it, we are already historical beings, right? We are already sort of already historical, and so it's not, as you said, it's not something that comes out of nowhere, and I think that was one refrain that helped me to put into context why you might be so interested in this shift from and Husserl giving privilege to whether it be the history of philosophy or just the historicity of ideas themselves, and that's an important part of the puzzle.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, Dilthey is an interesting case because in Philosophy as Rigorous Science, you may remember, you read that, you said one of the things that Husserl does there is to attack Dilthey.
Yes.
For being a historicist or historical relativist or whatever. And then, 30 years later, he has saying a totally different tune. It's as if he had learned to take Dilthey seriously, and Dilthey's views about historicity, about the role of history in our, not just our thinking, but our makeup and our whole, being in the world, you might say.
Yeah.
And that's where, Dilthey really won out in that, if you can consider it an argument. Of course, Dilthey was long dead by the time this crisis was written, but Dilthey won the argument.
Now, I think if I remember maybe in a footnote in your translator's intro, you do point out that Husserl at least claimed he wasn't singling out Dilthey in particular, but the critique came across that that he was targeted. Am I remembering this correctly somewhat?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he does well. He's very polite about it, of course.
Right.
But I think there's some disclaimer there. But I think he says something like, "Well, Dilthey doesn't claim to be a relativist, but if we just look at what he says, then you have to conclusion." So, and this was actually it's an interesting interaction because Dilthey read Husserl's logical investigations when it was published in 1901 and praised it to the skies. He said, "This is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I'm now going to use this method that Husserl's devised for my own work." So,
Wow.
and so Husserl then 10 years later turns around and attacks Dilthey very ungratefully, I think. And so that's sort of where things stood when Dilthey died in 1911.
I see.
But Husserl, not just in the crisis, but all through actually his middle period, he was very attentive to what Dilthey wrote about the human sciences,
Mhm.
the Geisteswissenschaft, and then about uh, personal life and motivation, other things that Husserl took up later, in which he drew on Dilthey considerably, because Dilthey, had been interested in something called descriptive psychology.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what Husserl was up to as well. I've lost the picture here. I don't know why this happens, but
Oh, we can still see you. Hopefully it comes back in. And of course, if we ever have a moment need a moment to reorient Coop.
well, I got it back, and I don't know
Okay.
how I did it, but anyway, I'm back in.
Coop will always edit these for if we need a pause. And I guess I would say, just in response, one of the things, well, I guess two things. One of the things I remember in reading Dilthey was his, in discussing, when he does discuss certain philosophers and think about them in terms of the history of philosophy, he notices how they can be reduced to kind of bloodless vessels, and that part of his investigations, or part of what he's interested in philosophy, insofar as it has a history, is, I don't want to say it's like vital force, but insofar as it is
Right.
Historically relevant and sort of living and breathing and all of this.
Right. Yeah, this is actually, a good occasion to mention a term that Dilthey uses a lot, and that is the term Leben, or life.
Mm-hmm.
Another person who uses that term a lot is Nietzsche, right?
True.
And another person that uses it a lot is Bergson. And it's because of this, people have talked, retrospectively about life philosophy, or philosophy of life,
I see.
as something that comes to the fore during this period, right at the end of the 19th century. Now, you couldn't find three more different philosophers than Nietzsche, Dilthey, and Bergson, right? But there's something that they do have in common, and this concept of life is also important for Husserl.
Yes. The life world, especially at the end, right?
Life world, he talks about lebendige Gegenwart, the living present, and there are all kinds of uses.
Our Leibniz, lived
of the
experience.
Yes, and so this term, it's really important, and he gets it really from Dilthey, I think, not from Nietzsche. He doesn't know anything about Nietzsche, or and he knows a little bit about Bergson, but not much. But he gets it from Dilthey, whom he ended up admiring, really, and borrowing from in many respects, and this is one of them. So it's a concept of life. It's not a biological concept. It's not a
right
holistic, élan vital kind of thing that you find in Bergson and others. It's the idea of the life of consciousness, the life of experience, and as opposed to death, I guess, but it probably means not just the mechanical. and causal, but the living, the life of consciousness. That's what he's interested in.
Yeah, I guess if there were an opposite, it would be, and this is just to try to bring in, I'm thinking towards, because the way you order your essays in, there's a way in which you could have put the third part, which is about Erlebnis, which is about lived experience, which is about embodiment. You could have perhaps put those essays first, leading up to history, insofar as there's you mentioned Dilthey and his interest in the Geisteswissenschaften, and there's a sense in which Husserl thought phenomenology would be that sort of central I don't know, method that could embody the so-called, what would we call it, the humanities, I suppose is what we would call them in
Yeah.
English. And I guess, since this is a very broad spectrum, I guess if you could say a few words perhaps about okay, so if life for me, and this was my point, I guess it would be eminently phenomenological in Husserl's sense, right? As you said, the life of consciousness. And so if it had an opposite, it would seemingly be something like, whether it be the analytic tradition and sort of its focus on, whether it be logical positivism or linguistic type problematics. In any case, I'm thinking about the two questions, if you will, and these are broad, so you can sort of give your take on them. One would be, as you mentioned, Husserl didn't really read much Nietzsche, and as you mentioned too throughout your essays, he didn't really care much or read much Hegel,
Right.
although he did know Kant. And so is phenomenology in Husserl's sense meant to harken back to Kant, but then maybe formalize it as a methodology? Or do you want to maybe say a little bit, as we get deeper into your book, just to set up what or where Husserl gets inspired to take up this name and use it to describe this methodology of consciousness?
You mean Kant?
Oh, well, I guess I meant insofar as Husserl is not taking from Hegel's phenomenology and implanting it, at least as you seem to indicate. He's where I guess why the term, besides does it not go back to Kant and this notion of phenomena and how they appear for consciousness? Is this kind of Husserl's?
So you're asking about the term phenomenology then?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting story, really. Hegel, of course, had written the Phenomenology of Spirit, and Husserl never had much time for Hegel. He thought, in fact, German idealism in general, Fichte, Schelling, all these people, for him, were windy speculators who he said at one point, I think, that we have to take the paper money of German idealism and cash it in for the hard, cold cash of phenomenological investigation. So he didn't have a very high opinion of German idealism, and that included Hegel, even though he'd used the term phenomenology. And but he did like Kant. It took him a while to realize that he was doing something very similar to Kant. Kant didn't use, well, he may have used the term phenomenology in one footnote or something, but he didn't really use it importantly. And so, and of course, by the way, generations of scholars have been puzzling over the connection between Hegel's phenomenology and Husserl's phenomenology, trying to figure that out. I spent some time on that too. I mean, I think you can say a lot about the relationship, which is kind of accidental, really.
Right. Okay.
But I don't want to go into that. That's another topic.
Yeah.
So I don't know, how did we get to the phenomenology?
I suppose I was saying that Husserl seems to. I think you mentioned along the way in your essays that Husserl believes phenomenology could be this method of Geisteswissenschaften. So that's maybe how Dilthey and and Husserl could relate on this topic, even if Husserl isn't mainly writing on the humanities, but
Right.
that the method that he works out could encompass, let's say, the humanities or the
Well, I think,
yeah.
yeah, I think he does, and he starts out in the ideas thinking primarily about the natural sciences, and then he opens up the question of what about the humanities, and it turns out that I think you're right that he thinks that phenomenology itself is one of the humanities, or it is maybe the master humanity, among one of the places to see this is in the Crisis Part 3,
Okay.
where he talks about something called what he calls the path from psychology
That's right.
to phenomenology. So since he is espousing, like Dilthey, a kind of humanistic psychology, then he sees uh, the possibility that we can make the transition from humanistic psychology to phenomenology.
Right.
And one of the thing he's concerned that is how to introduce phenomenology. And the way to do it is to think in terms of a humanistic psychology and then make certain moves beyond that, where the topic is no longer just subjectivity or consciousness, but what he calls transcendental subjectivity or consciousness. And that we can go into what that means if you want, but that's of course that's the place he wants to go. That's the end point here of this discussion.
Yeah, that's some of the last that's sort of where the manuscript starts to end,
Yeah.
right? On transcendental psychology. That's at least that's some of the last of part 3, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I'm just looking through. I suppose instead of talking about that, we might be able to relate it to terms used in your book, where what I really like is, for example, and this is, I'm just thinking this may be towards the end, this may be the last essay in the volume where the title of your book is its name, where it's, let me just double check if I'm correct on that.
Experience in history.
Yes, yes. And you bring up a phrase that I think is related to Arthur Danto, um, where he is investigating the metaphysics of everyday life, and you bring out the possibility throughout these essays, not just in that one, this notion of that Husserl's phenomenological method is too often reduced to sort of individual consciousness, or we could focus too much on that and not give enough credit to how much he spent on the question of intersubjectivity, whether it be in the Cartesian Meditations or in the Crisis, as we just said. And so I like how you rework this notion of metaphysics of everyday life as a metaphysics of social and historical life, which
Right.
would give precedence to a sort of a plural subjectivity in how that could be phenomenologically relevant. I know that that's worked out more in or Leibniz and or is no
Well,
it's
it's actually,
intersubjectivity and embodiment. Yes.
where it is actually in this book of essays. It's a thing about embodiment.
Yes.
The question there is intersubjectivity and embodiment.
Yes.
And what I do there is, and I've worked on this a lot, but I get it from Husserl. It's the idea of a plural subject, or a intentionality of the first person plural, is what I call it.
Yeah.
This is the we subject. In other words, you think of subjectivity as being an I subject, and that's what a lot of phenomenology is about. But it's not only about that, it's also about groups, communities, and their intentionality, their their thoughts, but also their actions and so on. And then, of course, finally, what I ask in that essay that I just mentioned is, well, look, we can't understand individual subjectivity without embodiment. What about plural subjectivity? Is there a body there too? And if so, what would it be like? And that's what I talk about in that sense.
I really like your use of, is it William McNeill?
Yeah,
I
very good.
really thought that this concretized the notion of an esprit de corps, as we might call it, right? But he's talking about, and I'm very much reducing his even your description of it, but he's talking about, say, the experience of, as he mentions, 1941, even before America has entered the war, he's drafted and he experiences, he kind of describes phenomenologically this experience of marching in tandem with other bodies, with other soldiers, and
Yeah,
this upsurge of a kind of, I mean, he doesn't just call it joy, he calls it a kind of feeling. I don't know. Maybe there's a sort of comfort. There's a sort of belonging,
well,
an
kind of
intense feeling. Yeah.
solidarity, I guess, is another
Yes.
term that could be used. That's a great book, by the way. I just was so happy when I discovered that. And it turned out I knew this guy, not personally, but he was a member of the editorial board of History and Theory. That's a journal that
Okay.
I'm also on the board of that. And he's well known as a specialist in what they call world history.
Mm.
It turns out world history is actually a special theme in history. And so you don't just talk about, the history of Prussia or something like that. You talk about the history of the world. And Jeremy Diamond is one of those people who do that. And anyway, that's what he does. But he wrote this book, which just, I mean, doesn't fit in any of that. And it's just this whole story about dance and rhythm and marching and all this
Yeah.
stuff he talks about there. And what I saw in there was a picture of what plural, subjective embodiment is really like. And so I picked up from all his descriptions and then tried to build on that an account of intersubjectivity, plural subjectivity, and embodiment all thrown together somehow.
I like the title of his book, which I just found, Keeping Together in Time, Dance and Drill in Human History, which sounds like a very dry book, and it may obviously at parts have to be scholarly speaking, but it really concretized this notion of, and again, we have that French phrase, esprit de corps, but this sort of feeling of a plural body. And obviously, as you point out, and as he himself, I assume, points out, this can obviously be used for ill or for good. We can imagine totalitarian fascist regimes. We can imagine goose stepping and all of this, but reducing it to that, I think, is a I think that's a mistake, as though as though it could be because, and I like that you say this kind of in passing. If we think about this movement in tandem of bodies that go beyond the individual parts, right, to create a kind of syncretic rhythm and whatnot, you point out in passing that we have to think of this in this historical manner as preceding and perhaps even helping to give birth to language itself. And I thought that was a very good point in terms of, because we normally think about in terms of being together generally in a linguistic framework, but that might be to overdetermine some of the fundamental grounding of that
Well, that's
formation.
true. I don't know if we can say it precedes language, but I think it escapes language.
Okay.
In the sense that I'm always very critical of, the linguistic turn and put all this focus on language, because I think there's so much more to human experience than language. And I think this is a perfect example of it. dancing and time, rhythm, movement, all these things are done without the aid of language.
Mhm.
And sometimes language is integrated, sometimes not, but you might say language is not the point. It's not
Right.
what we're saying, it's what we're doing and how we're moving and that kind of thing, that in which our subjectivity and our activity and our intentions are expressed.
One of the things I thought about when you brought up this example was I was thinking back fondly to the most recent Olympics, and I thought about one of the last events that my wife and I watched was synchronized swimming.
Yeah.
And if you question a we subject or a phenomenology of the we, just look at something like synchronized swimming.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure. You could look at the Rockettes. Anything
Yeah,
like that, synchronized dancing, swimming, all those things are really just incredible, especially if you haven't done them, as I haven't.
right.
So, just to think about how that happens and how it comes together, is really quite magical. And it is subjective. It's subjectivity expressing itself. It's just not that it's not my subjectivity, it's our subjectivity. That's what's going on.
And I guess broadening outward, and this is partly why I said you could have started with these essays on embodiment first,
Yeah.
leading into history rather than the way you order them in your book, starting with history and then coming back to thinking about embodiment. This is not a criticism. I'm just kind of thinking about.
Well, in philosophy, everything's related to everything else. So you can
Right.
start there. It doesn't matter. I think that's probably right.
I guess relating it to the historical and a lot of these investigations, obviously we should at least do a little bit of your questions of teleology before,
Yeah.
but I do want to say that I liked how by front-ending the historical in your essays, you already bring out, by the time we get to this question of embodied plural subjects, we've already been thinking about the way in which history is experienced communally and as a we. And I think that is something that is goes back to the Dilthey quote that I mentioned, right? Because it's not just about I or you or he or she or they are already sort of historical beings before, or already observers before sort of studying it. But it is an experience of the we, and you give, even in your introduction, you give examples of this. Obviously, the most recent being something like the pandemic, right?
Yeah, I talk about the pandemic and the protests there as a way of getting into this subject. My claim, of course, is that experience is not just something we know about or learn about by reading books or whatever. It's something we actually experience, and we're in the middle of it, especially in moments like this where everybody is affected by, either it's mass protests or it's mass sickness or illness or whatever. Um, we're all involved, and we're very much aware of that as we're going through it, and that's really what I call the experience of history.
We become much more self-conscious or much more aware in the stark discontinuities rather than the continuities, but that doesn't mean that there isn't historical shared lived experience in when things are seemingly going
That's right.
smoothly.
That's
And
right. I make that point too, that these extraordinary examples bring out our embeddedness in history, but it's always there, even if it's not, if it sort of recedes into the background. And so that's something I claim in that introduction as well. Yeah, I just reading from somebody else, and also remembering, I earlier wrote about the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Right.
And I also wrote an essay about 9/11. And, these were also examples. I sort of stopped using them because a lot of people are, I don't know about you, but are too young even to remember those experiences. But they were both incredibly striking in this sense. I mean, if you grew up in the Cold War, as I did, with the threat of nuclear war hanging over your head for all those years, it's hard to imagine just what that fall of the Berlin Wall meant. I mean, it was
Right.
incredible. I mean, it was, and of course, what's important about it wasn't just about me or my history or my experience. It's about all of us. And
Mutually assured destruction, right? It was a mutual threat.
there's a mutual threat, and most people thought it would never end. It was just went on and on. And the idea that it would actually end was totally unheard of, I think. But there it happened. Of course, it didn't happen in a day. It took some time. But the fall of the Berlin Wall, which, by the way, I was very well acquainted with,
Right.
in personal terms, it was a kind of concrete embodiment of that whole event, of the whole history of the Cold War and its end. So one of the ways I put it is that it's like a turning point.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know where it's going or what it's turning toward, but it's a turning point. And ordinary life has somehow ended.
Now, this nicely can dovetail into teleology. And I suppose I'm trying to think that I think I had one last contribution to make before we turn to that. I'm trying to recall, and I may have I suppose I may have lost. I mean, there's so many things we could obviously point out, in but I don't necessarily want to derail us. But I will say what I immediately thought of in you bringing up your experience. And I know that Coop, you're a little bit older than me, but you and I mean, I was born in 85. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, I did not necessarily have the wherewithal to experience, but after the fact, it became a touchstone.
Yeah.
And was one, something that one learns about, and so I have like a belated experience of this, but I'm thinking about and this relates obviously to your investigations in the philosophy. Oh, I know what I was going to say before we get into teleology. I like your move from asking this a sort of metaphysical question about history. What is history? And the epistemological questions about history. How do we know whether the verification of certain historical events or whatnot, which are provinces of the historians and are not they're not for any means bad questions, but you ask the question from your philosophical perspective and a phenomenological question about sort of the experience of history,
Right.
and that being unique to the phenomenological method, and why it's important, I think, just to showcase or just to highlight this lived experience that is communal and has a plural subject. It is about the experience of history that is unique to. It was one of the guiding threads and refrains throughout all of these essays.
Right. Yeah. In other words, traditionally, philosophy of history has been either metaphysical, that is, what is history, a historical process, does it have a goal or a direction, and all that stuff, or epistemological, that is, how do we know about history? And then you can talk about evidence and, interpretation and all this stuff. But I want to raise a third kind of question, which is how do we experience it? And that's so I'm trying to approach the philosophy of history in a different way than it has been traditionally, and that's the phenomenological way. So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty important. That it's a concept that I keep repeating every time I write about this stuff. So it's not that it's pretty obvious anyway.
Well, and it was already animating your thinking in I guess this was before the fall of the Berlin Wall and time narrative in history, where you are thinking about these perhaps in more dialogue with Paul Ricoeur and this question of how
Yeah.
narrative and shapes not only our understanding of history but also our self-understanding.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Uh, yeah, my I wrote that book in the 80s, and it was a kind of a reaction to especially Hayden White and people who were influenced by structuralism, post-structuralism, and so forth, who were looking at narrative as something sort of abstract and on a different plane from ordinary experience. Hayden White, I mean, this is of course a gross simplification of what he's doing, but he writes as if historians make up these stories, or they get them from somewhere,
right.
and then they impose them on historical events and dress them up, make them into something comprehensible, but in the process actually distorting them, because his real life doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. It just goes on one damn thing after another, and historians impose this narrative structure on them. And I was trying to claim there that no, this is a narrative structure. It's not just imposed from the outside, it's inherent to our actual experience. And
Right.
so, when the historian comes along and reinterprets, the historian is working with something that's already there, namely already narrativized and structured according to narrative principles. So I try to show how ordinary experience is narrative in the sense that it's not just random stuff. It's got a structure which is determined by our perception, by our action, and the temporality of our lives. So that was the point in that period, which so I think it was my best book, actually, in many ways. It's not very long.
I mean, it generated a lot of discussion. I was able to find
Yeah.
much more secondary literature. Even today, my friend sent me a very recent essay about sort of your discussions with Paul Ricoeur, and it was interesting just seeing like, well, David Carr says and Ricoeur,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh well, I was kind of reconstructing in my head, but I guess the one thing I would say is immediately to just clarify your point. In my head, the first thing I thought of, which is something that even Hegel talks about, and I think Leibniz and on, is Caesar crossing the Rubicon, and he himself is narrativizing the alia jacta est, the die is
Yeah.
cast. Like he's already sort of narrativizing this type of
That's right.
of beginning, middle, and end. That we're approaching the denouement, at this
That's
point.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to sort of caricature the way people talked about it, I mean, the Battle of the Stalingrad, it's just a bunch of people running around not knowing what they're doing. And then the historians come along 10 years later and just say, oh, that's the Battle of Stalingrad, turning point of the war in the East, and so on. But that's not the way it is. I mean, they may not have told the same story of what they were doing as historians did later, but they were doing something that had a story to it that they were trying to bring off in their actions. So, yeah, I just thought that was it was a caricature of the relation between thought and action that was going on there. And Hayden White was just tremendously influential. I mean,
Right.
he really captured a whole lot of people were thinking. But I was trying to, it was a corrective to that, I think, that I was trying to bring about there.
Some of this comes up. You at the end of your book, you do discuss Hayden White in very fine detail, but you already see some of the elements of this in the early part of your book, where and maybe Hayden White comes up in relation to this. I forget in your discussion of hindsight and how that
Yeah.
this can be taken to the point of almost parody or extreme skepticism, as I don't know if that's fair to call Hayden White a skepticist, but it
Well,
does
he's
come up
skeptical
with
about history, that's for sure.
right.
He really raises, questions. I mean, historians are just distorting the past, and um, instead of telling us the truth about it, which is what they want to do. So that's certainly skeptical. I think, if anything, that's why a lot of historians hopping mad, of course, when they read Hayden White, because they thought he was robbing them of what they wanted, which was their ability to tell the truth about the past. And that's why a lot of them liked me, by the way, because I was trying to preserve the
Okay, yeah.
capacity to tell the truth. People who like to classify things described me as a historical realist
Hmm.
as opposed to a historical skeptic, I guess. I never kind of liked that term very much because I didn't think I was talking about realism. It's not about the real world. It's about the subjective world, the lived world, life
Right.
sense. Um, but I did want to say that the kind of narrative structure that we find in history has its counterpart, its origin, really, in the narrative character of ordinary experience and action.
I think that's the interesting thing to come out of this is I'm just thinking about Husserl's kind of distinctions between, say, like a naive realism, which is perhaps sometimes just lumped into the term realism in general,
Mhm.
versus his discussion of, let's say, the ideality of geometry, because it's not about going back and finding some original Thales geometer that gave birth to the discipline. That our way of historically accumulating the knowledge of geometry and learning it without having to go back and reconstruct every point along the way, we can talk about this historical uh, sort of heritage as an ideality in a way that doesn't mean it's just in our heads, right? That it is still, just because it's ideal doesn't mean it's any less real or any less historically lived or any less,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
it's not purely mental, right? And so yeah, but in any case, I guess this does help to get into this question of telos and teleology, because I was just thinking, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have someone like Fukuyama writing the end of history, and he comes up throughout the book to help, maybe, if not, he's the target of your version of philosophy of history, which is phenomenological, and asks that different question we mentioned. But he seems to resurrect the specter of Hegel, so to speak, except now it's that the fall of the Berlin Wall shows that capitalism is won, or something like
That's
this,
right. Oh,
right?
yeah, absolutely. The Cold War is over and we won. That was
Yeah.
the story that he liked to tell. And he thought that Hegel, foresaw this and, the idea of the end of history. I mean, he did he did a good job in the sense that a lot of people paid attention to what he was saying. And his book was on the bestseller list and all that. Um, but it was a little bit strange to see this happening because, well, I mean, who can talk about the end of history? I mean, that was just absurd. I think he was actually a cover for George Bush and the neocon
Yeah.
who were going to civilize the rest of the world and take over. And that's what that was all mostly about. Um, but it was I still use that book in my philosophy of history classes to illustrate this idea of how much Hegel survives,
Mm-hmm.
200, 300 years later or whatever. This idea of the end of history, which of course takes us to the concept of teleology, which you want to talk about, I think, where
Yeah,
there.
we've circled around the middle of your book, and I think that maybe that can help us to to finish out and round out our discussion. But I did find this discussion fascinating, and I guess one of the things that I really liked, although maybe this is anticipating a bit, is your insistence about if there is anything like well, okay, maybe this is jumping too far ahead, but I liked you go back beyond Hegel to someone like Kant, who is much more humble and maybe circumspect about what the philosophy of history could be,
Yeah,
insofar as he obviously doesn't write as much on it as Hegel, but in the when he's thinking about universal history and sort of promoting the idea of a perpetual peace, you point out that it's not in this what we generally think of in this theoretical way, right, as the movement of world spirit, but as something practical in the sense in which it is an ought that has to
that's right.
ideally be worked out by humans in act.
Right. Yeah, I think Kant is very circumspect about this. And it does, I mean, it belongs to his practical philosophy in the sense that his ethics belongs to his practical philosophy. It's about, as you say, it's about ought, not about is. So he's saying, yes, we should. And we should move in the direction of, world peace or whatever. But that doesn't mean we'll succeed. And but at least we can't rule it out. That's sort of what he's. I mean, it's like his views about freedom. He says he can never prove that we're free, but you can't disprove it either. So why not
Right.
act as if we're free, and in doing so, be moral beings. So in a sense, what he says about history is similar to that, and he's trying to outline what it would be like if it's possible to move toward some kind of peaceful relations between nations, and I think that's as far as he goes.
I do like that you also bring up Kant throughout the book in another direction, which is related to what you just brought up concerning freedom, which is insofar as teleology seems to dominate at least the classical version of philosophy of history, it runs up against very quickly, and I assume Fukuyama is lumped in here too, to what Kant describes as a sort of dialectical illusion,
Right.
where
Exactly.
we take our subjective sort of framework and the categories of the understanding as inherent in the things themselves. And
Right.
that type of projection, if you will, like he gives the example of the moon, that the astronomer knows the moon at its height is not bigger, yet it appears to us
Right.
as such. And so
And
we have to be sorry, go
nothing
ahead.
nothing that we know does away with that illusion. So it still looks bigger,
Mhm.
no matter what we know. And so that's what, that's his example or his illustration of what a transcendental illusion might be like, that that something is a necessary but misleading conception. And that's where the idea of teleology comes in. I use that illustration to make the point that, maybe we have to think about history as moving towards some kind of a goal. But that's because of the way we think, not because of the way it is.
Would this perhaps make Hegel's cunning of reason itself a dialectical illusion that he perhaps takes to be the reality and actuality of the rational? Or is that perhaps too much of a broad stroke?
No, I think that's exactly what Hegel does. he's very critical of Kantian caution and Kant's sort of skepticism, I guess is a good word, about metaphysics. I mean, for Hegel, it's all go for metaphysics, and that means that if he thinks that we can make the connection between action and telos, or between the present and the future, the end of history, or whatever, then we should go ahead and make it and not be shy about it. I think that's a Hegelian sort of temperament. He's Hegel's a very audacious thinker, and
Yeah.
he wants to break down all these restraints that are imposed, that have been imposed by Kant, his predecessor, on what philosophy can do. And so, and it's interesting to think of him as reacting to the Enlightenment in a certain way. In his youth, he was a big fan of the French Revolution. But what he was doing at the end of his life was putting together all those things that had been torn apart by the Enlightenment. That is the rejection of religion, skepticism, anti-clericalism, and so on, putting them back together. And his idea of freedom is a perfect example of that, right? Yes, we're free, but that means within constraint. And so you get this, he distinguishes between the negative sense of freedom and the positive sense of freedom. Negative is just freedom from restraint. Positive sense of freedom is freedom within institutional confines, societal structures, civil society, law, and so forth. That's somebody said philosophers are either splitters or lumpers. And, I think of Kant as a kind of splitter, and Hegel's the supreme lumper of all times. I think he tries to have his cake and eat it. I mean, that's just
have a split and lump it too, right? That's what spirit is supposed to do, I suppose, right?
That's right.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I guess there's a sense in which you seem to, and again, I'm not saying you side with Kant on this, but it seems like you find more in this in a kind of, maybe there's more practical in the phenomenological method in its approach to the philosophy of history than there is in the sort of theoretical considerations of Hegel's world spirit. So if one can land on either side of that big binary, you do seem to call for more practicality if the philosophy of history is going to keep resurrecting itself like it does with Fukuyama and whatnot.
Well, yeah, I just want constraint, but I must say, one of the things that I often emphasize is that my conception of phenomenology is really minimalistic.
Okay.
Phenomenology is not solving the problems of the universe. Its aims and its accomplishments are very modest, and what it can do competently, if it does its work, is to make an accurate description of human experience and to try to help us understand sort of how we fit into things. But, solve the riddle of the universe, or whether it's what's real or what's not real, all those classical metaphysical questions, forget about it. It's not going to help you. It may not be much, but it can do a good job of what it does. And we should be content with that, because frankly, when it comes to all that other stuff, I'm very skeptical. I just don't. All the stuff that philosophers wanted to figure out, finally can't be done.
I suppose then to sort of segue into the outro and give you a forum to talk about perhaps the things you're working on. currently and in the future, the last thing I would suggest with the minimalism in mind, it just made me think about some of the if perhaps Husserl reaches back beyond Hegel to Kant to give birth to phenomenology in a way that is non-Hegelian. There's also a sense in which he seems to harken back to the transcendental in Kant, insofar as it kind of, if we think about the bracketing and the epoche, there is a sense in which the minimalism is inherent to the Husserlian program, and part of it is to outlaw or delegitimize some of these more transcendent instances that we see in the philosophy of history, like certain, whether it be in Lyotard's notions of the big meta narratives, right, or in the way in which teleology in Hegel's version is this transcendent movement of world spirit through the cunning of reason. So there's maybe in the minimalism there is an emphasis on a type of immanence, or what is immanent, not only to perhaps phenomenological everyday lived experience of the I or we version, but also in this historical experience that you're investigating. There's a certain immanent approach that would outlaw some of these bigger moves that and maybe bolder, but also rash moves like Hegel and Fukuyama want to impose.
Yeah. I think another way of thinking about this is to invoke the phenomenological reduction. And which comes in fairly early, but it's really key to everything in this sense that philosophers think they have to choose between realism and idealism. You got to be one or the other. You can't. And so, then they look at the phenomenological reduction and they say, well, is that realist or is it idealistic? Which is it? It's got to be one or the other. And of course, my claim is that it's neither one or the other, that it's trying to find a third way, which is neutral with respect to those classical distinctions. And what that means is that it's just talking about our experience as we live it, and whether the real world is real or ideal or whatever, that's just not our problem.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for people to accept that, because a lot of people have come to phenomenology wanting help in solving their classical metaphysical problems. And this is why, of course, my claim is that the reason the Catholics were always the ones who saved phenomenology from positivism and so forth is that they wanted help from phenomenology in order to reinstate their Thomistic metaphysics or whatever. So you have the role of the Father von Breda and the Leuven archives and all that stuff, but they were bound to be disappointed, I think, because I just don't think that's what Husserl is trying to do. And so they can do their own thing, but don't expect much help from phenomenology, I think.
I'm trying to remember, and this is just an aside, this isn't really a big question, but I'm trying to remember in the translator's introduction to The Crisis, didn't you mention, and this is about Husserl's biography, didn't you mention he was a Protestant convert?
Yeah, he was.
So the Catholics are barking up the wrong tree, even though Husserl converted. He didn't convert to Catholicism, right?
That's right. That's actually very interesting, but Husserl was a Jew who, of course, born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was the case, I think, that in order to get a really public servant job, you had to be a Christian, but you had a choice between being a Catholic and a Protestant. And so Husserl, like a lot of other people, Gustav Mahler and other people from his background, converted not to Catholicism but to Protestantism. Why? Because they thought that it was much, it didn't really have all that much theology to it.
Yeah.
And in fact, Husserl was in line with a classic American tradition, the so-called Jefferson Bible. Did you ever hear about that?
I have. I haven't read it, but I've seen
Well, you know
snippets.
what?
And
This is a typical case of Thomas Jefferson. Really was very skeptical about the religion stuff, but he thought that Jesus was a great ethical teacher. And so he actually did something about it. He went through the Bible, the New Testament, and he cut out all those passages.
that's an epique right there, right? He's bracketing,
That's right.
he's bracketing
That's right.
God and all of this.
That's right. So he put together this book. I've never actually read it, but it's well known of the sort of, the Bible as I see it. The most important things in there are ethical teachings, and the Sermon on the Mount and this and that and the other, and that's what really counts in Christianity. It's not all the other stuff. So Husserl, I don't know if he knew about the Jefferson Bible, but he certainly had this feeling that Jesus, for example, was a figure for him, as it was for Jefferson, of ethical enlightenment. And so I think that's how he managed his conversion, and in the process managed to make himself eligible for professorship in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I don't think he ever, took his Protestantism very seriously.
Right.
Except for that, he was genuinely interested in ethics, and he did think that religious leaders can be inspiring and important in formulating ethical principles. That's about as far as it went.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about the sort of atheistic Bible or something like this. It makes a lot of sense coming from that version of Enlightenment deism and whatnot.
Right.
And anyway, that obviously opens up into these other questions. But I was trying to think of something sarcastic to say about sort of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition turning to Husserl and not being satisfied with the middle, ironically, the middle way that you're, if there is this middle path between realism and idealism, they didn't want the golden mean in that sense. So
right, yeah. I mean, this, by the way, the time when this happened, when Husserl was a student, I guess, was the time when Reform Judaism was just getting started.
Okay.
I mean, in Germany, especially in Austria, and a lot of people thought that Reform Judaism and sort of Reform Protestantism were just really basically the same thing. They were all about, and which is, by the way, exactly the same time as the so-called social gospel in the U.S. and England, where everybody thought, well, the point of religion is not all this miracles and stuff. It's all about ethical principles, and
right.
I think that's what Husserl believed as well. He never went the route of Reform Judaism, but some philosophers did. Hermann Cohen, who was a famous neo-Kantian in Marburg, was a thinker kind of in this mold, who held on to his Judaism, but thought of it in sort of Reform terms. So that's a kind of interesting background to Husserl and how to understand him. I think he, had some really interesting thoughts about ethics, which a lot of people are working on now. I haven't done much myself, but
would these not have been in the main books? Would these be like unpublished manuscripts?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And of course, the unpublished manuscripts, it's like talking about the elephant in the room. I mean, there's just 40.
He was very prolific, right?
40 volumes by now, and they're still coming out. I don't know if they finished. They keep saying they're going to finish, but these were, I mean, he had a huge collection of manuscripts and generations of people were scribbling over these. Some of them were written in shorthand.
Wow, yeah.
pure shorthand that people used in Austria back in the turn of the 20th century, and so people learned it in order to translate these things. Anyway, there are all these volumes of his collected works that on just every conceivable topic, and they're very interesting, and they're worth it too. I mean, I used to think, well, maybe this is a little excessive, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, and on all kinds of topics.
Yeah, I remember, and this is the last. I promise, and then we can give you the outro. I remember you saying somewhere in talking about the different interpolations of the editor, and Eugen Fink has interpolations, and Husserl himself has some interpolations, and you remarked, I think, that you couldn't make out, maybe it was Husserl's shorthand in some of the comments on the Crisis manuscripts.
No, it wasn't I never learned the shorthand.
Right. Okay.
So what I was dealing with was a typescript.
Oh, okay. I see. Yes.
Was made by Fink, I think, at some point there, and so that's all I had to go on. So I was comparing Beamel's edition with this typescript, and finding, that he had, I don't know, elaborated on stuff that I didn't think was valid. So I was kind of putting my hand in as an editor of this, and that's when I discovered all this sort of chaos of this manuscript. It was just not really finished at all, and that was it's a tragedy in a way, because Husserl was practically on his deathbed when he was still working on this,
and supposedly there's supposed to be 2 more parts to it, right? At the
that's
very
right.
least.
That's right. And the story of Fink, by the way, is an interesting one. Fink was very admirable in that he remained loyal to Husserl even in the Nazi period, and saw him every day, talked to him, and so forth. But he also wanted to put in his own ideas into Husserl's thought. And in doing so, I think he kind of went astray and tried to make Husserl into something else. And the interesting story is Fink was also talking to Heidegger at the same time.
Right.
Heidegger and Husserl were no longer talking. They hadn't talked for years, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But Fink was kind of in both camps, and so I think he imported a lot of Heideggerian ideas into some of these things, which he published separately. I mean, there's a 6th meditation to add.
I did not know this. No, I didn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was Fink wanted to write the 6th meditation. Descartes had 6 meditations, right?
Right. Okay.
And so when in the Cartesian meditations, Husserl had 5, and he and Fink were discussing how to write a 6th. Well, it turns out that Fink's ideas for the 6th meditation were kind of far from what Husserl really wanted. And so the result is that Fink published the 6th meditation under his own name. And
interesting.
And Husserl never really, signed on to it. So it was a kind of split, I think, at the end, even though Fink was very loyal and courageous, really, in staying connected with Husserl. He was not loyal philosophically, and finally they parted ways philosophically. And that, is a question that I always had: is why did Husserl abandon the Cartesian meditations and start writing the Crisis? Very different text. And the answer is, I think he thought Fink was taking it in a direction he didn't want to go.
Right. Okay.
But then you have to add in all the political stuff that was going on.
Yeah.
That had a role too, So Husserl wanted to had commentary on the political situation, I think.
Yeah, the early 1930s in Germany, Austro-Hungary. I can see how that is. It would, and I maybe he had a premonition of the end of his life, and
Oh, sure.
it is interesting, but that's obviously we could devote several episodes to even just little pieces of the European
Yeah.
the crisis book, and but I am glad that we see, as I said, the interest that you already show in expounding his ideas in the translator's introduction carries over throughout this work, and so readers and listeners will be able to get a good flavor of some of those questions and problems just by obviously by listening, but by reading your book, they'll get to see some of that. And so what we usually do, I mentioned that we always ask the origin story, but we also kind of ask, this is kind of a retention, protension type thing. We also ask what you have currently going on, or what perhaps you have forthcoming, or what, if any, future projects you are currently contemplating.
Okay. Well, I'm not planning a book at this point. Um,
And no translations, obviously.
no translations, no indeed. No, I'm, I'm in a way, this is kind of a realistic, people ask me to write papers and contribute them to conferences. And so I do that, and then they get published in, collective volumes and stuff. And that's all I'm doing right now. But I mean, I have certain themes that are
Yes.
to me right now and that I'm working on. One is collective intentionality. I was just in Copenhagen a couple of weeks ago and gave a talk there on this topic. And what I usually do is, I'm basically I'm a Husserlian. There's no question about it. I can't deny that. But I don't try to just repeat Husserl. I try to develop his ideas into ideas of my own. And so I was, in this case, commenting on a whole literature that's grown up about plural or shared intentionality, as it's called.
Right. Okay.
To talk about problems that arise in respect to certain other authors. Dan Zahavi and other people have written about this, and I'm sort of reacting to what they've written. So that's one topic. I also had a paper recently at a conference called The Phenomenology of Crisis, and this is something that I've done before, but I've sort of elaborated on that. What is it? This is a good historical topic, right? What does crisis mean in the context of history? And I was sort of comparing, the current political crisis, which is coming up next week, and how that relates to the crisis that Husserl was reacting to in the 1930s, and how we can understand history in terms of a series of crises. And so that is a theme which, of course, I can borrow from Husserl, but I'm not limited to what he said about it. And my thinking is that it has a lot to do with temporality and with our sense of the future, and the idea of sort of being stymied in a situation in which the future is something we simply can't predict, can't make sense of. And I think that's the situation we're in now in many ways. So that's one. So that's another theme. And I have in several places, and some of them in this book too, this collection, been thinking about trying to understand phenomenology and where it fits into the philosophical firmament, right?
Yeah.
And some of the stuff that I've said already today, indicates that. I don't think it can do a lot. I think philosophers kind of start with the ambition that they want to figure everything out, get to the bottom of things, and all these are very, typical philosophical urges and desires,
ambitions.
ambitions. And I think that, every philosopher really should have to come to terms with the fact that they're not going to get very far in that quest. So I try to articulate that insight by just saying what I think phenomenology can do and what it can't do. And so few of my recent papers have been about that topic. So
About that minimalism that you were describing.
minimalism, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is that's good, and it seems like we touched upon a little bit of each of those. Maybe not as much about crisis in general, which again could be a very long episode. Not to mention like Marx and capitalism in crisis.
Right.
And Nietzsche always, instead of crisis, talked about decadence, like values and decadence, but capitalism in crisis. And but that could have been a whole topic or three, right there.
Yeah, exactly. I've Nietzsche and I don't get along. I decided that pretty early on. I get the fact that a lot of Germans love him because he's such a great writer. I mean, he's witty. He's just he's all over the place. But I'm not on the same wavelength, and I think I find it very hard to place him in the tradition of German philosophy that means a lot to me. That is the one that goes from Kant, to Hegel, and
he's a bit of a heretic, isn't he? Even though your discussion of Lewis, meaning in history, you seem to claim he's drawing on this Nietzschean inspiration.
Well, Löwit does. And I do like his book. Is this one book of his called Meaning in History that it debunks the whole idea of philosophy of history. Basically, what it does.
It's Lyotard before Lyotard and the grand meta narratives and all
exactly.
That, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's very clear to me that Löwit is a precursor of post-structuralism, and that, especially in that Leotardian sense.
Mm-hmm.
And well, he actually goes farther in one sense than Lyotard, because he says, well, the whole inspiration for this is basically religion.
Yeah.
And what's masquerading as philosophy of history is actually theology of history.
Yeah.
And he's not buying it, partly because Löwit claims to be a Nietzschean,
yeah,
a pagan. He even calls himself a pagan, which I think is great. And he attacks the teleological view of history.
Yeah.
He thinks that he subscribes to the Nietzschean idea of the eternal return, so this wonderful man that I listened to his lectures, when I was in Heidelberg, is just amazing thinker.
I picked that book up because of reading about him in your work, and I read through the introduction, and it really clarified a good sense. But yeah. We can leave that cliffhanger there. And David, I will say I really enjoyed talking to you about this stuff, and I know these things are planning. These things are. I guess I just want to say I would love to invite you back on at a certain point. If you enjoyed yourself today, you are definitely welcome, and I'm sure we'll be maybe sometime next year we can have you back on to talk about anything you like, because
I very much enjoyed this. Really, it's great. I mean, I got a chance to talk about myself and my work, and that's a lot of fun. But your questions have been good, and I think I learned more about my work by doing this. So that's great. And if you want to invite me back, I will be happy to accept. It's a great pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, maybe, who knows, you might be doing hundreds of podcasts before we have you back on. If this opened up the floodgates, maybe.
The floodgates, yes. Well. I doubt
Well,
it. But
well, you never know. I mean, listening, we've had guests on who we were their first podcast, and then they, other podcasts follow suit and invite them on. You never know. Maybe if there's not a Husserl podcast out there, maybe you should start one. There's
maybe I
never too
should.
late.
Maybe I should.
But
Okay.
David, Coop and I are going to we're gonna let you go and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. We're gonna stay on the call just to talk about future projects, but you may exit the call whenever you're ready. But I really want to thank you again for participating, and it was a pleasure.
Okay, well, my pleasure too. I will sign off here somehow if I can figure out how to do it.
In the bottom right, you should see leave, but
leave. Yeah,
I
there's leave.
will be in touch when the episode comes out. I will be in touch with you, and you can listen back and share with your friends. And until then, have a great month. I guess I told you it'll be a while, but thank you again.
Okay, you too. All right, bye-bye.
And once again, thanks to David Carr for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.